When Keanu Reeves' first-class seat was suddenly downgraded to economy, no one expected him to stay silent. But 8 minutes later, the airline president appeared, visibly shaken. What happened next didn't just expose a hidden agenda. It changed the lives of two strangers forever. Why did Keanu refuse the upgrade? And what secret was the airline hiding? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The airport at 11:43 p.m. was a quiet hum of delayed travelers and half-lit terminals. Keanu Reeves moved through the dim glow of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport with slow, unhurried steps. He wore a dark wool coat over a plain black t-shirt, a canvas duffel hanging loosely from one shoulder. No entourage, no assistant, just the quiet rhythm of a man used to solitude. He had just come from a low-key charity dinner in support of a children's literacy program. It wasn't publicized, no interviews, no photo ops. He'd left before dessert was served, smiling gently to the volunteers, thanking each server with the same sincerity he gave to producers and studio heads. Now, all he wanted was sleep. Just 6 quiet hours to Boston. At gate C-17, a young woman in a navy blazer stood behind the podium, nervously shifting weight from one foot to the other. She glanced up from her monitor as Keanu approached. Her name tag read Melissa. Her smile was professional, but as her eyes registered who was in front of her, she froze for a beat. "Mr. Reeves?" she said quickly. I'm so sorry. There's been an adjustment." Keanu waited, quiet. Melissa glanced at her screen again. "There was an unexpected reconfiguration of the aircraft. Our first-class cabin was reduced from 8 seats to 4 due to equipment changes. You were originally confirmed in 2A, but we had to reassign your seat." He nodded once. "So, not first class?" "No, sir, you've been reassigned to 29C, that's economy aisle. I know it's a huge downgrade, and I completely understand if you'd rather wait for a different flight." Keanu's expression didn't flicker. He just offered a soft, tired smile. "That's all right. I'll take the seat." Melissa blinked, startled. "Really? Most passengers? Of course, sir." She printed the boarding pass quickly and handed it to him with both hands. "Thank you for your understanding, and again, I'm sorry." Keanu nodded, his voice calm. "You're doing your best, it's okay." The gate behind her opened with a quiet click. Keanu walked through without a glance back. Around him, a few passengers exchanged glances. A man elbowed his wife and whispered, "That's him, right? That's Keanu." He kept walking, stepping down the jet bridge with his bag brushing gently against his leg. Row 29 was at the back of the plane, 3 rows from the restrooms, just in front of the galley. The overhead bins were nearly full, so he tucked his duffel under the seat in front of him. His legs didn't fit well in the narrow space. He folded them the best he could and lowered himself into the worn fabric seat. It smelled faintly of stale coffee and peppermint gum. A toddler in the row behind kicked the back of his seat. Twice. Then again. Keanu smiled faintly and closed his eyes. The flight hadn't even taken off yet, and already he knew sleep would be a battle. A flight attendant named Carla passed by, doing a quiet head count while balancing a tablet in one hand and a stack of safety cards in the other. She paused when she reached Keanu's row, doing a double take. "You're him," she whispered. Blinking, Keanu nodded politely. "Only on screen." She gave a breathless laugh, then leaned down slightly. "Mr. Reeves, I am so sorry about the seating mix-up. We were told this plane had the usual first-class layout, but they switched it last minute to a compact configuration. No lie, it's been chaos since 7 p.m. "It's all right," he replied softly. "I've had worse." Carla hesitated, then offered him a small packet. "This is the upgraded amenities kit. It's not much, but just something to make things a little more comfortable." He accepted it with a nod of gratitude. The contents were simple. Earplugs, a small lavender-scented wipe, and a sleep mask. He tucked it into the seat back pocket without opening it. She moved on, still glancing back over her shoulder. Across the aisle, a college kid in a hoodie stared openly, phone in hand, but too nervous to ask for a photo. Behind him, a teenager elbowed his mom, whispering too loudly, "That's John Wick, Mom. He's sitting back here with us. What is he doing back here?" The mom looked over, then quickly shushed him. Keanu tilted his head, caught the boy's eyes, and gave him a small smile. The boy looked like he'd won the lottery. As the final passengers boarded, the energy shifted. The plane felt heavier, not just with people, but with the tension of late flights, misconnections, and restless children. One woman banged her suitcase against 3 armrests as she tried to squeeze into a window seat 2 rows ahead. A man muttered something angry under his breath about upgrades and customer service. Another pulled out a neck pillow that took up half the row. Keanu didn't move. He sat still, his breath slow, his eyes half-lidded. He had learned over the years how to disappear in plain sight, even when everyone knew exactly who he was. The seatbelt sign dinged. A voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're just finishing up final checks before our departure to Boston. Flight time tonight is 5 hours and 47 minutes. We'll be flying at 36,000 feet. Sit back, relax, and we'll be in the air shortly." Keanu leaned his head against the window and watched the tarmac glisten with distant taxi lights. He thought briefly of the silence of the hotel room waiting for him in Boston, the script pages he hadn't finished reading, the friend he was going to visit tomorrow in hospice care. It was going to be a long night, but he was used to those. As the plane door sealed shut with a muted thud, the atmosphere in the cabin settled into an uneasy hush. Keanu adjusted the small air vent above him, sending a soft stream of recycled air across his face. It smelled faintly of plastic and lemon disinfectant. A small child in the row behind him began singing quietly, off-key and repetitive. It wasn't annoying, not to Keanu. It was human, real. He reached into his canvas duffel and pulled out a worn paperback. The spine was cracked, the pages yellowed. On the cover, a tiny handwritten note in the corner read, "From Mom, keep this close." He turned to the first page. Before he could begin reading, the kid behind him kicked the back of his seat. Twice. Not hard, just enough to make the whole thing shake. He turned slightly, offering the boy's mother a gentle nod to let her know it was okay. She looked mortified, mouthing, "I'm so sorry." Keanu shook his head softly and smiled. "He's got energy. That's a good thing." She relaxed slightly, mouthing thank you. A chime sounded. The plane began taxiing. Across the aisle, an older man in a sport coat leaned over toward Keanu, lowering his voice. "Not gonna lie, son. I thought I was seeing things. Never figured you for economy class." Keanu looked up from his book. Neither did the airline. The man laughed and offered a handshake. "Name's Dennis." Keanu shook it. "Nice to meet you, Dennis. You heading home?" "Eating east," Keanu replied. "Not sure if home is there or not." Dennis raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. He nodded as if he understood anyway. "Well, wherever you're going, I hope it's worth the ride." "Thanks," Keanu said. "Me too." The plane lifted off moments later. The engines whined softly as they left the ground behind. Keanu watched the lights of Seattle blur below, distant and flickering like fireflies. As the seatbelt sign turned off, the boy behind him kicked his seat once more, but this time only once. Then there was quiet. Keanu leaned back, eyes closed, listening to the muffled lull of air vents and page turns and headphone static. The world inside the aircraft became its own little bubble, suspended, sealed off from everything below. He thought about the last call he got from his friend in Boston. The voice had been thin but cheerful. "If you've got time, I'd love one more night to talk like we used to. No cameras, just real." That's why he was here, not because of work, not because of appearances, because some things don't wait. He shifted in the cramped seat, trying to stretch his legs in the narrow space. His knees touched the tray table. He didn't complain. Instead, he reached for his book again, flipping through until he found a passage that felt like an old friend. The page read, "Dignity doesn't need space, it just needs truth." Keanu smiled and kept reading. Riley stared down at the folder in her lap. Her fingers picked at a frayed corner. For a long second, she didn't speak. Then the words came, quiet and fast, like she'd rehearsed them to herself before. "My first audition," she said, "I cracked on the high A. Second one, I made it to the final round, but they told me I lacked emotional conviction." She gave a small, bitter smile. Whatever that means when you're standing under a fluorescent light singing in Latin to 3 judges who don't blink. Keanu looked at her, then out the window into the dark. "Maybe it means you were singing for them, not for you." Riley blinked at him. "That sounds like something my mom would have said." He smiled softly. "She sounds wise." "He's stubborn," Riley said. "Told me I should have stayed in the church choir, married someone safe, got a job at the bank like my cousin. But I keep coming back. To this." She tapped the folder again. Keanu leaned back in his seat, adjusting the neck of his jacket. "So this is the last try?" She nodded. "Yeah. I can't afford to keep flying out and failing. This time, I told myself, if I don't make it, I walk away. I teach. Or I do weddings, or I—" She stopped herself. "I don't know, just something else." The hum of the engine filled the pause. Riley glanced sideways at him again, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Sorry, you probably don't want to hear a stranger's mid-air breakdown." "I've heard worse," Keanu said calmly. Then, after a moment, "Actually, I've had worse. My first audition, I forgot the lines halfway through, just stood there." She turned more toward him, surprised. "Wait, you mean like an acting audition?" He gave a slight nod. "For what?" "Some theater thing. I was 17. I wore my friend's too big blazer and thought frowning made me look deep." Riley laughed before she could stop herself. "So what happened?" "Baby let me finish. Then thanked me and called the next guy in. I rode the bus home thinking, that's it, I'll never try again." "But you did," she said quietly. He nodded. "So why did you?" He considered that for a moment, as if he hadn't been asked it in years. "Because someone told me that the worst thing I could do wasn't failing," he said slowly. "It was turning my back on something that still moved me." Riley's mouth parted slightly. She stared at him for a moment, then nodded like she understood, even if it hurt to hear. "Yeah," she whispered. "That's the part that doesn't go away." Riley shifted in her seat, hugging her folder tighter now. The plane hit another small bump, but this time she barely noticed. Something had shifted between them. Not familiarity exactly, but ease. She no longer felt like she had to perform. "I was 7 the first time someone told me I had a voice," she said. "My music teacher had us sing Amazing Grace. Most kids mumbled through it. I just felt it. I don't even remember thinking, it just came out." And the room went quiet. Keanu watched her quietly, not interrupting. "After that, I sang everywhere," she went on. "School concerts, funerals, baby showers, anywhere someone needed a song. I didn't even care what it was for. I just liked the way people listened, like they needed it." She looked down, brushing a stray thread from her sleeve. "But you get older and people stop listening. They want perfect. They want polished. They want someone with connections. My last coach said I have the tone of someone who grew up in a basement church, not a conservatory." Keanu's brow creased slightly. "That's not a flaw. Tell that to the judges." Silence again. Only this time, it was thoughtful, not awkward. "You said you were tired of flying out and failing," Keanu said after a pause. "But what if it's not failure? What if it's just sharpening the blade?" Riley looked over. "Sharpening the blade?" He nodded. "You keep showing up, even after rejection, even when it hurts. That's not weakness. That's grit. And maybe grit is what makes a voice carry further than the rest. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, she just gave him a long, grateful look, like something inside her had just been seen, clearly and without pity. Then her voice dropped to a whisper. "You know, I almost didn't come tonight. I had the folder packed. I even printed the music. But right before leaving, I told myself I'd sleep instead. I was just done." "What changed your mind?" She hesitated. "I walked past a busker near the station," she said. "He was playing cello. Beautiful, aching sound. And I thought, what if I never get to feel that again? What if I stop showing up, and I lose the part of me that listens?" Keanu nodded slowly, then spoke, his voice barely above the hum of the engines. "Then don't stop." For the first time since takeoff, Riley leaned back in her seat, exhaling like she'd been holding her breath for months. Neither of them said anything else, but the silence between them was full and deeply human. 8 minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft leveled out into the night sky, a hush swept through the economy cabin like a ripple on still water. It started with a glance from one flight attendant to another, followed by a hurried exchange near the service curtain. Then came the whispers. A sharply dressed man had just stepped aboard. From the front, not the jet bridge, and he wasn't part of the flight crew. Passengers craned their necks, some whispered behind raised hands, others pulled their phones closer, sensing something unusual was unfolding. The man was tall, impeccably groomed, and walked with a confident stride that didn't match the nervous expressions of the two airline staff trailing him. He wore a tailored navy suit, a muted silver tie, and a lapel pin bearing the emblem of Altura Air. He wasn't here for refreshments or a mechanical issue. Keanu Reeves looked up calmly as the man reached row 29. Riley stiffened beside him, sensing the collective attention from all sides, now focused squarely on them. The suited man stopped and extended his hand, but not before lowering his voice and leaning slightly forward. "Mr. Reeves, I want to personally apologize," he said. "There was an unacceptable error in our seating protocol. I'm Marshall Levin, president of Altura Air." Keanu blinked slowly, registering the man's presence with measured politeness. Then he gently shook his head. "No need, Mr. Levine," Keanu replied, voice quiet but steady. "The seat's fine." Marshall hesitated, clearly unprepared for that answer. He gestured discreetly toward the front. "We've prepared a private space for you in our forward executive cabin. It's not typically used on domestic flights, but I've made the exception." "Is someone else getting moved to make space?" Keanu asked, tone even. Marshall's lips parted, but no answer came immediately. One of the staff behind him shifted uncomfortably. Keanu waited. "Technically, yes," Marshall admitted at last, "but they'll be upgraded elsewhere. No inconvenience." Keanu turned his gaze forward, as if measuring the weight of such a decision. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "truly, but I'll stay here." Marshall blinked, stunned. He lowered his voice further. "Mr. Reeves, with respect, this isn't just a seat issue. It's an image problem. People noticed. There are phones out." Keanu turned to look at Riley, who was frozen in disbelief, her folder once again clutched tightly against her chest. He then looked around at the nearby rows, at the young mother still wrangling her toddler 2 rows up, at the elderly man trying to doze under a flimsy airline blanket. "I think your image just improved," Keanu said softly. Marshall straightened, his jaw tightening. Not in offense, but perhaps in realization. "Understood." Then, just as swiftly as he'd arrived, he nodded to the staff and made his way back toward the front. A long silence followed, broken only by the gentle hum of engines and the low, collective wonder settling over the cabin. Keanu shifted slightly in his seat, legs cramped, back upright, and smiled. Riley hadn't spoken a word since the airline president had walked away. She was still staring at the aisle, eyes wide, folder pressed flat against her lap. Her voice, when it finally returned, was barely more than a whisper. Did that actually just happen? Keanu leaned back against his seat, legs slightly angled to avoid the armrest digging into his shin. "Seemed like it," he said with a quiet nod. She exhaled, shaking her head in disbelief. "I mean, I knew who you were the second I saw you at the gate, but I didn't think they'd, send someone after the plane took off. And not just anyone. The airline president. Marshal Levin," Keanu said, then chuckled softly. "Sounded important." "Sounded terrified," Riley murmured. A few passengers across the aisle were still looking their way. One teenage boy, 2 rows back, had his phone angled just slightly over the seat back in front of him, pretending to scroll, but clearly filming. Keanu didn't seem to mind. He kept his eyes forward. "I've never seen anyone turn down something like that," Riley said, after another long pause. "They were about to roll out a red carpet." "Sometimes the floor's fine," Keanu replied. "So is row 29. Her eyes lingered on him for a second too long, then she blinked and laughed under her breath. "That's not normal, you know." He turned to her. "Maybe normal isn't always right." Riley looked down at her hands. Her folder had slipped open slightly again, exposing the edge of her resume, where a bent paper clip held together faded audition notes and a copy of her recommendation letter. She gently tucked it back in. "I'm trying to figure out," she said, "if that was just humility or defiance. And not both." That made her laugh again. This time, it wasn't nervous. "I don't know how people like you stay grounded," she said. Keanu tilted his head, considering the word. "Maybe because staying grounded," he said, "reminds you what flying feels like." That line hung between them for a while. She smiled faintly, almost sadly. "I've tried to stay grounded so long," she said. "I forgot what it was like to believe I'd actually lift off." He didn't interrupt, didn't reassure her with platitudes. He just waited. She took a breath, unsure why she felt so willing to speak more. Maybe it was the surreal calm of the cabin. Maybe it was the gravity of someone like Keanu choosing humility over attention. Maybe it was just the presence of someone who listened without judgment. "I guess I just needed to see someone say no to something shiny," she said. "Makes me feel a little better about chasing something fragile." Keanu nodded once, then adjusted his seat. "You ever think," he said slowly, "that fragile things are just strength in a different shape?" Riley didn't answer. She only stared ahead and didn't look away. The plane had settled into a cruising altitude, but the energy inside the cabin was still shifting. Whispers continued in waves, people stealing glances toward row 29C, trying to piece together what they'd witnessed. Some had recognized Keanu immediately. Others were just trying to understand why the airline president had appeared, spoken briefly, and then left, empty-handed. But Keanu wasn't focused on them. His eyes were half closed, one hand resting on his knee, the other tapping a slow, invisible rhythm on the armrest. Not from boredom, more like memory. Riley turned toward him again, the tension in her posture softening. "I don't want to bother you," she said, "but I have to ask, why didn't you take the seat? You could have been in a private cabin, maybe even asleep already." He thought for a moment before responding. "Because I was already where I needed to be." Riley tilted her head slightly. "I mean," Keanu added, "sometimes the point of a journey isn't comfort, it's proximity. You never know who you're supposed to sit next to." Her cheeks flushed. She didn't know how to respond to that, whether it was meant as something casual or deeply intentional. Before she could overthink it, a flight attendant returned, this time holding 2 steaming cups of tea. She crouched discreetly at their row. "This is from Mr. Levin, compliments of the airline," she whispered. "He insisted." Keanu accepted 1 cup with a small nod. "Thank you." Riley looked at hers, but didn't touch it right away. The smell was calming, chamomile, and something citrusy. She finally reached for it, her hands steadier than before. The flight attendant smiled, and he said to extend his personal apologies once more. He was hoping you'd reconsider the private cabin. Keanu just smiled gently. Tell him thanks, but I'm good right here. The flight attendant nodded and disappeared back down the aisle. Riley watched her go, then looked down at the cup in her hands. I think I'm sitting next to a paradox. How's that? Keanu asked. You're the most famous person on this plane, and yet somehow also the most invisible. You're not performing for anyone, you're just here. That's the idea, Keanu said. Here is enough. Riley took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle inside her. I've been chasing there for so long, she said softly. I forgot what here feels like. Keanu didn't reply this time. He just tapped that same quiet rhythm on the armrest. And beside him, Riley closed her eyes, without fear of the next audition. The plane hummed above the clouds. Row 29 had never felt more like first class. The aisle was still murmuring with surprise when Marshall Levine, the airline president, did something that caught even the flight attendants off guard. Instead of returning to the front cabin, he looked back down the narrow row and gave a short nod. Without a word, he unbuttoned his suit jacket and sat down in the open middle seat, right between Keanu and Riley. For a moment, no one spoke. The businessman across the aisle nearly dropped his tablet. A woman 3 rows ahead nudged her husband, eyes wide. Even the child behind Keanu stopped kicking the seat. If it's good enough for you, Marshall said, adjusting his tie with the faintest smile, it's good enough for me. Keanu looked over at him, one eyebrow raised, not an annoyance, but quiet curiosity. Riley blinked. Wait, you're sitting here? Like, for the whole flight? Marshall nodded. 6 hours to Boston, give or take. I figure if we're going to talk about humility and service, I might as well practice what I preach. He wasn't loud, he wasn't dramatic, but in that cramped row 29, with tray tables scratched and the hum of the engines growing louder, something shifted. The tension eased. A few passengers smiled, a couple clapped, someone whispered, "Who is this guy?" Riley slid her folder back into her backpack, trying to process what had just happened. The head of the airline had just squeezed into economy, with knees barely fitting, to sit shoulder to shoulder with 2 strangers. Well, she said, half laughing, if this flight gets any weirder, I'm going to have to write a musical about it. Keanu gave her a sideways glance. You sing. You've got the material. Marshall smiled politely, but didn't laugh. His gaze had drifted downward, thoughtful, distant for a moment. You all right? Keanu asked, gently. Marshall blinked and nodded. Yeah, just reminded of something. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small photo, the corners soft from being handled too often. He held it up between them. A young woman, barely older than Riley, stood on a dimly lit stage, wearing a red scarf and holding a microphone with both hands. Her face was lit not by the spotlight, but by something in her expression. Raw vulnerability. My daughter, Marshall said. Emily. Riley leaned closer to see. She looks brave? She was, Marshall said quietly. Graduated top of her class from the Chicago School of Music. Got into the Boston Conservatory with a scholarship. Started strong. Then came the auditions. And the first rejection. And the second. And he didn't finish. Keanu didn't press. Riley did neither. Instead, they sat there. 3 strangers who now shared more than space. The seatbelt sign still blinked above, but the flight, somehow, had already taken off in more ways than one. Marshall tucked the photo back into his pocket, but his hands lingered there, fingers curled slightly, like he was still holding it. She quit last spring, he said finally. Not the program, just the singing. Said she couldn't do it anymore. Keanu didn't respond right away. He looked forward, to the dim curtain separating economy from the front of the plane. It swayed slightly, nudged by air currents, like a breath no one had taken yet. Then, softly, Keanu asked, "Did she stop singing or just stop singing in front of people?" The words landed with a strange silence, not because they were confrontational, but because they were true. Marshall's head tilted slightly, as if the question had caught him off guard. Riley turned to look at Keanu. Something in his tone made her feel like he'd asked that question of himself once. Maybe more than once. Marshall gave a tight smile, almost painful. "She says it's the same thing. I'm not sure I believe her." Keanu nodded slowly. "It's not the same." The conversation drifted then, quiet for a few moments, like they all needed to breathe through something invisible. The plane rattled slightly with mild turbulence, but no one flinched. Riley reached into the seat pocket and pulled out a tiny napkin. She turned to Marshall. "Does she still sing in the shower?" she asked. He chuckled despite himself. "Actually, yeah. Still hums in the kitchen. Sings when she thinks no one's listening." "Then she didn't quit," Riley said simply. Marshall glanced at her, startled. "That's what I used to think too," Riley said, voice gentler now. "That if no one heard me, it didn't count. That if I wasn't performing, I was failing." "And now?" Marshall asked. "I'm still figuring that out," she admitted. Keanu looked at her. "How long have you been trying for this conservatory?" Riley exhaled. "This is my third time auditioning. Technically my last chance." Marshall looked over. "Third time?" "Yeah," she said. "First time I choked, couldn't get through the second verse. Second time I got bronchitis, bombed it. This time, it's everything or nothing." She laughed, but it didn't sound amused. "I told myself, if I don't make it, I'll stop chasing it. Grow up, get a job, sell insurance or something." Marshall raised an eyebrow, and, "That's your dream?" "Not even close," she muttered. They sat with that for a while. The hum of the plane filled in the silences. Someone coughed a few rows behind them. A baby cried softly in the distance. Keanu leaned back, stretching his legs just slightly. "Sometimes the third time isn't the charm," he said. "Sometimes it's the decision." Riley glanced over. "The decision?" "Yeah," he said. "To keep going, even if they don't let you in." Riley looked at Keanu like she wanted to ask something deeper, but hesitated. There was something unspoken between them now, something fragile. Maybe it was the altitude. Or maybe it was the way Keanu said things, not to sound profound, but because they came from a place that had been broken and stitched back together. Marshall crossed his arms and sat back. "I always thought if I gave my daughter the best opportunities, the best teachers, she'd thrive. She did for a while, but the moment she faltered, it all crumbled. I couldn't fix it." "You weren't supposed to fix it," Keanu said gently. "You were supposed to witness it. Be there." Marshall blinked, and for the first time since taking that seat, he looked tired in a different way. Not jet-lagged, just human. Like a father who realized he'd been standing in the doorway, watching a daughter vanish quietly into silence. Riley shifted slightly in her seat, folding her arms across her folder now. "It's hard when you love something so much that failing, it feels like betrayal." Marshall turned toward her. "That's what she said. Almost exactly that. Like the stage betrayed her. And she betrayed herself by freezing." Keanu nodded. "Fear of failing can become more painful than the act itself." Riley nodded slowly, and her fingers tapped lightly on the folder. "I used to think that if my voice cracked once, I was done. That one wrong note made me unworthy. And now?" Marshall asked again. "I still believe it a little," she said. "But sitting here, talking to you both, maybe it's not about being perfect. Maybe it's about being honest." The plane rumbled again. This time the turbulence was softer, like an exhale. The lights dimmed slightly overhead as the attendants moved down the aisle, checking for seatbelts and tray tables. Keanu reached into the pocket of the seat in front of him and pulled out a pen someone had left behind. He turned to Riley. "If you could write one line," he said, "not to the judges, but to yourself, what would it be?" Riley hesitated. Then slowly, she uncapped the pen and wrote on the back of a napkin. One short line. "Even cracked glass reflects light." Keanu read it, nodded once, and smiled. "That's your encore." Marshall stared at the napkin for a long time. "I think I'm going to text that to my daughter." He pulled out his phone. For once, it wasn't to check stock prices or approve a flight manifest. It was to send a sentence that might matter. Riley leaned back in her seat, folding her arms. "Weirdest flight I've ever taken," she whispered with a laugh. Keanu chuckled softly. "Best one I've had in years." The seatbelt sign dinged. The captain's voice crackled overhead. But for the three of them, it wasn't just a flight anymore. It was something else entirely. Something that might just stay with them forever. The cabin lights dimmed gradually, as if the night itself had slipped inside the fuselage. A hush fell over the rows of weary passengers, many already nodding off beneath airline blankets or resting their heads against the cool windows. Only the low hum of the engines and the occasional cough broke the silence. Keanu adjusted in his seat, arms loosely folded, head gently resting against the wall. Riley sat beside him, eyes open, staring forward but not really seeing the tray table in front of her. She held her folder closed on her lap now. It hadn't moved since Marshall took the middle seat between them, and no one had asked her to put it away. In the dark, it had become more than just a folder. It was a promise to herself and a weight. For a while, none of them spoke. Not even Marshall, who had been silent since Keanu's question about his daughter still lingered unanswered. Then, without warning, Riley began to hum. It was soft. So soft, Keanu thought at first it might be a murmur from somewhere else in the cabin. But no, it was coming from just beside him. A gentle melody, lilting and uncertain, like someone walking barefoot across a creaky old stage. It wasn't a song with lyrics. It was just a tune. Maybe something she remembered from childhood, or something she made up right then. Keanu closed his eyes and listened. At first, that was all he did. Listen. But after a few bars, his throat stirred, and he quietly began to hum too. A harmony, low and steady. Not too loud, not showy, just enough to match her sound, to meet it and follow it gently. Riley glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. She didn't stop. She didn't speak. Her lips curled upward just slightly, and she adjusted her pitch. The melody shifted, rising, falling, like a dance where no one led and no one followed. Only movement, only sound. Together, they created something that didn't need an audience, something that belonged to that cabin, to that hour, to that strange and sacred moment when the rest of the world had closed its eyes. Beside them, Marshall didn't move. His breathing remained slow, steady, but he was awake, and he was listening. He'd closed his eyes long ago, but not to sleep. He was pretending, partly because he didn't want to break the spell, and partly because he didn't know how to participate in something that honest. But as he lay there, surrounded by quiet voices that never raised above a whisper, tears slipped down the sides of his face and into his collar. He pulled out his phone beneath the privacy of the folded blanket and opened a message draft to his daughter. The last message they'd exchanged had been months ago. Words had failed them both. But now, beneath flickering overhead lights and quiet harmony, he typed just 6 words. "I think I finally understand." Riley's voice trailed into a breath, letting the final note hover and disappear. Keanu didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it fade completely. Some moments deserve an ending. Riley glanced over at him, unsure. "Did I mess that up?" she whispered. Keanu looked at her, the corners of his eyes soft. "No," he said simply. You let it breathe. The cabin around them remained still. The man across the aisle continued snoring. A baby whimpered 3 rows ahead, then went quiet again. But in row 29, something had changed. Unspoken, yet undeniable. For a while, they just sat like that. Marshall sat upright now, but his phone was turned face down on the tray table. His breathing had shifted. Not shallow or nervous like earlier, but deeper. More settled. Riley stared down at her hands. They were no longer trembling. In fact, they felt strangely warm, as if the humming had awakened something inside her. She looked up at Keanu. That wasn't even a real song, she said. I don't know why I hummed it. Maybe it was real enough, he replied. She gave a breath of a laugh. You sound like one of those Zen fortune cookies. I get that a lot. They both smiled. Marshall spoke for the first time since the duet ended. My daughter used to sing like that, he said, voice low. Not for anyone, just around the house. In the mornings when she made coffee, when she thought no one was listening. Keanu turned his head, listening. She started singing less after she got into the conservatory. I don't know why, Marshall continued. Pressure, maybe. She was brilliant, but she told me one day that it stopped being music. Said it became survival. Riley nodded slowly, her voice quiet. I think I know what she meant. Marshall looked at her with kind but searching eyes. And yet you're going to audition again. That folder in your lap? 3rd time? Riley nodded. Where's the evidence, he asked. Not dismissively, but like a man asking the question for himself. She thought about it. Her fingers brushed the worn edge of the folder. Because it still lives here, she said, placing her hand over her chest. Even when I'm scared, even when people stop believing, it's still here. It's the only thing that ever felt like home. Marshall looked away, blinking fast. Keanu didn't say anything. He just reached forward and gently pushed the tray table back into its locked position for him. The lights flickered briefly. A signal from the cockpit announced they were entering smoother air. The turbulence from earlier had faded. The plane stabilized. I think she stopped singing in front of people, Marshall whispered. But maybe she never really stopped singing. Riley said nothing. But a few moments later, she began to hum again. Not loud, not for attention, just enough to remind the cabin that something beautiful could still live in the dark. This time, Keanu didn't hum along. He just listened, with his head turned slightly toward her, eyes closed, and a faint smile on his face. Riley's hum softened, melted into silence, and stayed there. No need to stretch it, no need to prove anything. She leaned back in her seat, still, not asleep, but at peace in a way she hadn't felt in weeks, maybe longer. Keanu rested his head lightly against the seat too, shoulders finally relaxed. The hum had done something strange, like wringing out the tension from the air itself. There was nothing left to brace against. Marshall stared forward. His phone buzzed face down. He didn't check it. Instead, he reached slowly into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thin, cloth-bound notebook. Not a business planner or briefing memo, just a personal one. The kind someone carries for thoughts they don't say out loud. He opened to a clean page and wrote something at the top. Things I never told her. Then he paused. His pen hovered. Riley glanced sideways and caught the words. She didn't comment. Outside the cabin windows, the sky was beginning to pale. Somewhere down below, the country stretched out asleep in cities and towns they'd never see. But in this narrow aisle, in row 29, a different kind of map was being drawn. Not of geography, but of people. Of small collisions that quietly rewrote direction. Keanu looked out the window but didn't see anything, not because of clouds, but because he was remembering something. A voice. A small classroom. His own first audition, the one where he'd frozen halfway through his monologue. The teacher who told him afterward, "Sometimes the silence says more than the words." He hadn't understood it then. He did now. Riley shifted and looked over. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" Keanu asked. "For not making it a big deal." He gave her a small nod. The best things usually aren't. Up ahead, a chime rang. The captain's voice came through the speaker, low and smooth. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Boston." As the seatbelt signs lit up and people stirred awake, Keanu, Riley, and Marshall remained quiet. What they'd shared hadn't needed applause. It had already landed. The faint chime of the captain's voice broke the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent into Boston shortly. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." The cabin lights came up slowly. Riley blinked and rubbed her eyes. Her hands were still resting in her lap, fingers gently curled, as if holding the last note of the quiet duet she and Keanu had created. It had been less than an hour ago, but it felt like another world entirely. Fragile, unspoken, deeply real. Marshall Levine shifted beside them, adjusting his jacket. He hadn't said much since they finished humming, but he had written something on his phone. Now he glanced down at it again, his face unreadable. A flight attendant approached quietly, stopping beside Keanu's row. Her expression was soft, a little emotional. "Mr. Reeves," she whispered, "this is for you." She handed him a folded slip of paper, written in tidy cursive. Keanu opened it without a word. It read, "Thank you for showing us how to lead. Anna, flight crew." Keanu looked up, caught the attendant's gaze, and gave a small nod. No smile, no flourish. Just something in his eyes that said he'd understood. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man with graying hair leaned over. He hadn't spoken the entire flight, but now, with a quiet reverence, he extended his hand. "Sir," he said gently, "if you don't mind, I just want to shake your hand." Keanu glanced at the hand, then met the man's eyes. "Of course," he replied softly. Their hands met briefly, firmly. The man nodded in gratitude, then sat back. Riley was watching all this with a look somewhere between disbelief and awe. Not because people were reacting to a movie star, she'd seen that before, but because this wasn't about celebrity. It was about something deeper. Respect. Quiet influence. The way Keanu had changed the air in the cabin just by choosing not to demand more. She cleared her throat and spoke just above a whisper. "Can I ask you something?" Keanu turned toward her, patient as ever. "If I walk into that audition tomorrow, not because I'm totally ready, but because I believe, just maybe, that my voice might matter, is that enough?" He studied her face. There was no bravado in her eyes, just the raw, flickering courage of someone on the edge of trying again. He leaned in slightly, lowered his voice. "It always did," he said. "You just didn't believe it yet." Riley didn't respond right away. Her eyes shone, but she didn't cry. She simply nodded, once, with conviction. Behind them, Marshall watched it all unfold. He didn't interrupt. He didn't smile. He just sat there, absorbing the final notes of a lesson that hadn't been spoken, but lived. And outside the window, Boston's lights were rising to meet them. The plane leveled, and a gentle shift signaled their descent had truly begun. The soft rustle of passengers collecting headphones, jackets, and pillows broke the calm. But in row 29, no one moved. Keanu glanced out the window beside Riley. The city was a blanket of amber and blue lights, stretching in quiet symmetry across the land. Tiny cars flowed like red blood cells through narrow arteries of road. Somewhere down there, Riley's moment waited, and she knew it. She reached under the seat to grab her folder, the one marked audition materials. Her hand trembled only slightly this time. She checked that everything was inside. Sheet music, a photo, a short bio. She flipped it closed and sat up straight. Marshall leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "What will you sing?" Riley didn't answer immediately. Then she looked up. "Something old," she said. "A lullaby my grandmother used to hum in the kitchen. I arranged it myself." Keanu nodded. "That's the right choice." Riley hesitated. "Even if it's not perfect?" "It won't be," he said gently. "But if it's yours, it's real. And real is what they remember." Marshall looked between them. Then, almost without thinking, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small photo. He turned it toward Riley. It showed a teenaged girl, curly brown hair, serious eyes, standing beside a grand piano in a conservatory hall. The resemblance to Marshall was unmistakable. "She didn't even flinch at the audition," he said quietly. "But at the recital, she froze, couldn't breathe, couldn't sing. After that, she walked away." Riley didn't speak. She just looked at the photo for a long moment. Marshall turned to Keanu. "Your question earlier about whether she stopped singing or just stopped singing in front of people." He swallowed. "I think she stopped believing her voice deserved to be heard at all." Silence. Then Keanu replied, "That's the difference. Technique you can lose and find again, but belief, that's what keeps the music alive." Riley was still holding the folder, but now her fingers wrapped around it with more purpose. The intercom crackled. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Marshall tucked the photo back into his pocket. Riley leaned her head against the seat for a second, eyes closed. "I'm going to walk in tomorrow," she said, "like my voice matters." "Because it does," Keanu said, without hesitation. Outside, the ground came closer, runway lights flickering in a clean row like a final breath before impact. Passengers fastened their belts. Tray tables clicked shut. The baby 2 rows up began to fuss again. Normal returned. But something had shifted, for Riley, for Marshall, maybe even for Keanu. And in that final descent, 3 strangers sat quietly, bound not by circumstance, but by something far rarer: understanding. The wheels touched down with a muted thud. A ripple of subtle motion passed through the fuselage as the plane slowed, tires humming against the tarmac. Some passengers clapped, a few yawned, but most sat quietly, waiting for the final taxi to the gate. In row 29, Riley's hands rested in her lap, folded over her folder. Her chest rose slowly as she breathed in, then again, as if trying to carry this piece into whatever came next. The seatbelt light chimed off. Overhead compartments opened with chaotic clunks. Jackets dropped, bags slid free. A voice announced that connecting gate information would follow shortly. But before Keanu could reach for his duffel, a flight attendant appeared. She didn't say anything at first, just held out a folded piece of paper. Keanu looked at her with a quiet question in his eyes. She smiled softly and whispered, "From the crew." Keanu took the note, unfolded it, and read the neatly handwritten words. "Thank you for showing us how to lead." He nodded once, deeply, then folded the paper and tucked it into his coat. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in business attire, someone who had been mostly silent the entire flight, stood with his carry-on. Before turning away, he leaned down slightly toward Keanu. "I've flown this route every month for 12 years, the man said quietly. "That wasn't just a flight," he hesitated. "Would it be all right if I shook your hand?" Keanu offered it, and the man gripped it firmly, then gave a small, grateful nod and disappeared into the aisle crowd. As the other passengers funneled out, Marshall remained seated. He seemed in no hurry, as if reluctant to leave this suspended space where things had shifted for him. He looked at Riley. "If you ever want someone in the audience who understands," he said, "you'll have at least one seat filled." Riley blinked, taken aback. "You'd really come?" "I've missed too many performances already," he said, "and not just hers." She gave him a small, shy smile. Keanu stood and lifted his duffel from under the seat. Before stepping into the aisle, he turned to Riley. "You asked if you could walk in with confidence." She nodded. "You can," he said. "Not because you're ready, but because you're brave. There's a difference." Riley's voice was quiet. "Do you really think my voice matters?" Keanu didn't blink. It always did. Riley held his gaze, and for the first time since boarding, she smiled fully. No apology, no hesitation. As they filed into the aisle, Marshall reached out and patted Keanu gently on the shoulder. "Thank you for the seat and everything that came with it." Keanu nodded once. Sometimes the back of the plane gives you the best view. The three of them stepped into the terminal. Three strangers, only hours ago, now changed in ways they hadn't planned. The world outside hadn't shifted, but something within each of them had. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The next morning broke cold and overcast, as if the city itself was holding its breath for her. Riley stood at the steps of the Boston Conservatory, folder in hand, boots still damp from the walk. The marble columns loomed above her, ancient and austere. Inside, her name was on a list taped to a wall. Her audition was scheduled for 9:40 a.m. room 204. She took the stairs slowly, each footfall echoing like a drumbeat of self-doubt. A receptionist waved her in with a tight smile. Other auditionees sat along the hallway, some clutching instruments, some pacing, a few humming under their breath. Riley sat down and pulled her folder into her lap, resting it against her knees. Her name was called. She walked into room 204. Three judges sat at a long table, clipboards ready, pens in hand. One of them, a middle-aged man with wire-rimmed glasses, barely looked up. Another, a woman with short gray hair and kind eyes, offered a faint nod. The third, a young professor in a turtleneck, was already checking his watch. The piano accompanist sat off to the side, looking bored. "Name?" "Riley Ward," she said softly. "Piece?" Held in silence. The pianist adjusted his bench. She gave a nod and the opening notes floated up like fog. But as she opened her mouth to sing, her throat constricted. The first few lines came out flat, hesitant, thin. One of the judges raised an eyebrow. The man in the turtleneck leaned toward the others and whispered something. The woman glanced at Riley, concerned. She almost stopped. Almost. But then she thought of the flight, of that wordless duet in the dark, of Keanu's question to Marshall, "Did your daughter stop singing, or just stop singing in front of people?" And suddenly the room felt smaller, not intimidating, but She took a breath, not just a breath, but the kind her mother used to teach her when she was 6 years old and scared of singing at the school recital. A breath from the belly, grounded, solid. She began again, no longer just singing notes. She told a story. Held in Silence was not a showpiece. It was a lullaby. Her mother's lullaby. The one she sang when the world was still safe, before detox clinics, before the voices and the bruises, before the long goodbye. Riley had changed a few chords in the bridge to mirror the grief arc. When she reached that point, her voice trembled, but didn't crack. One of the judges put down his pen. Another blinked slowly and leaned forward. The woman with the kind eyes brought a hand to her mouth. The room didn't applaud when she finished. They didn't have to. It was the kind of silence she'd never experienced before. A held breath, a sacred quiet. She lowered her hands and whispered, "Thank you." No one responded right away. She turned and walked toward the door, unsure of what had just happened, but certain she had finally told the truth through her voice. Riley stepped into the hallway and let the heavy door close behind her with a soft thud. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just breathed. For the first time in what felt like years, she had no urge to shrink or apologize. Her legs carried her down the corridor as if guided by something beyond effort, an invisible grace. The other auditionees looked up as she passed, but she didn't notice them. Her heart was still echoing with the last note. Not the one from the piano, but the one she had shaped from her lungs, her memory, her longing. A note that didn't ask for approval, just to be heard. She found the nearest restroom and splashed cold water on her face. Her reflection stared back, pale, freckled, eyes wide with something that resembled disbelief. She leaned closer and whispered, "You did it." And the words sounded like they belonged. By the time she made it back to the building's front lobby, her hands had stopped shaking. But then she saw him. Leaning casually against the wall just past the glass doors, Keanu stood in a dark coat, hands tucked in his pockets, his hair still tousled from the wind, his posture relaxed, observant. Not waiting, not intruding, just there. Her mouth parted, surprised. He nodded. Riley stepped outside into the sharp Boston air. She zipped her coat halfway, more out of instinct than cold. "I thought you had places to be," she said, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. "I did," Keanu replied, "but I was already here." Riley let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough," he said with a small smile. "Sound carries through old doors." She shook her head. "You heard it?" He nodded again. "All of it." There was a pause. A wide one. The kind that would have scared her yesterday. Not today. Keanu looked out at the street. A taxi idled at the curb. Students passed by with backpacks and instrument cases. Somewhere a horn honked and faded into the morning. "Him used to hum that," Riley said quietly. "Your mother?" She nodded. "Even after she got sick?" She couldn't speak by the end, but she still hummed. That lullaby. It stayed. "I believe it," Keanu replied. Riley folded her arms over her chest. "I don't know if I passed. I messed up at the start." "That doesn't mean you failed," Keanu said. "That just means it was real." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you really here?" He tilted his head slightly. "Because sometimes people show up for us when we least expect it. And sometimes," he added, "we need to remember what it feels like to be believed in." Her eyes shimmered. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome." She didn't ask for anything else. And he didn't offer anything more. It was enough. They walked together in silence toward the corner where the coffee shop stood. The morning sun had broken through the overcast sky, casting long golden shadows across the sidewalk. Riley glanced up at Keanu as they waited for the pedestrian signal to change. "I've always wondered," she said softly, "how you stay so calm. I mean, with people staring, talking, making assumptions. Doesn't it get exhausting?" Keanu considered the question for a moment. "It used to," he admitted, "when I thought I had to prove something. Then I realized I only needed to stay honest. To myself, to the people who mattered." Riley nodded, absorbing it. "I wasn't always calm, you know," he added. "I used to audition too. I bombed a few. Got told I wasn't expressive enough, not charismatic, too weird." She smiled faintly. "That's hard to believe." "True anyway." They crossed the street and entered the cafe. A bell above the door jingled. The scent of espresso and cinnamon welcomed them. Riley followed him to the counter where he ordered black coffee, then turned to her. "Hot chocolate," she said almost shyly. They took a small table by the window. Keanu stirred his drink slowly, gaze fixed out at the street, where a school group passed by, all bundled in scarves, laughing at something one of them said. "You said something on the plane," Riley murmured. "You asked Marshall if his daughter stopped singing, or just stopped singing in front of people." Keanu turned back to her, listening. "I keep thinking about that," she said. "I think maybe I stopped singing too. Not just publicly. Like, inside. Until last night." He looked at her, but didn't interrupt. "I was terrified walking in there today," she continued. "But it was different this time. I wasn't trying to win. I wasn't trying to prove something. I just needed to sing." "That's when it counts," Keanu said quietly. Riley glanced down at her cup. Steam swirled gently above the whipped cream. "Do you ever miss the anonymity?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "But then moments like this happen. Small moments that remind you why you do what you do. You didn't have to come. I wanted to." She smiled. A real one. The kind that didn't feel borrowed or polite. As they stood to leave, Riley hesitated. "Keanu," he raised an eyebrow. "Would it be okay if I wrote you, just to let you know what happens? I don't even know where I'll be next month." "Of course," he said. "But wherever you are, just keep singing." She nodded. He watched her walk down the sidewalk, coat fluttering slightly in the breeze. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. And for the first time in a long while, Keanu felt something rare. Hope dressed in someone else's courage. The podium sat beneath a row of glaring lights, and the airline's logo loomed behind it on a velvet backdrop. Marshall Levin adjusted the microphone with trembling fingers. The press room was packed. Reporters leaned forward, recorders in hand. Cameras flashed. Behind him, a PR assistant looked pale, clutching a folder of pre-approved talking points. But Marshall hadn't opened that folder once. He took a slow breath. This wasn't going to be a controlled message. It was going to be the truth. "Good afternoon," he began. "My name is Marshall Levin. I'm the president of Atlantic Sky." He glanced down at the podium, then back up. "I'm here today to talk about something that happened on Flight 1792 from Seattle to Boston. Specifically, something that involved one of our passengers, Mr. Keanu Reeves." Whispers stirred across the room. Marshall heard his own heartbeat. "Yesterday morning, our team reported an overbooking issue. The manifest showed our first-class cabin had been filled beyond capacity. A small glitch in the booking system allowed too many confirmed seats. We've had issues like this before. Normally, we resolve it by bumping a late check-in or offering incentives for volunteers." He paused. A few flashes from the press pit lit up his face. "But this time," he continued slowly, "I made a decision. I noticed Mr. Reeves's name on the passenger list. I thought to myself, what if we let this play out?" His jaw tightened. "Not maliciously, not with the intent to harm, but I imagined the headlines, maybe a few tweets, maybe a photo, something to generate buzz. A celebrity's reaction, hopefully a mild one, could give us exposure. We needed that." A low rustle of discomfort moved through the room. "I approve the downgrade," Marshall admitted, steadying his voice. "It wasn't a random algorithm. It wasn't a pure system error. It was a human decision. My decision." He looked out over the crowd and let the silence settle. What I expected was a complaint, a refusal, maybe a viral story of entitlement. He paused. What I got instead was silence. Not a silence of resignation, but one of grace. Mr. Reeves didn't demand anything. He didn't even raise his voice. He just nodded and sat down in 29C like it didn't matter. In the back row of a quiet Boston park, Riley sat on a bench with her phone resting on her lap. The live stream of the press conference continued in soft, pixelated detail. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, listening as if the words were only meant for her. Marshall's voice cracked faintly through the tiny speaker. "Elle didn't make a scene," Marshall said. "He made a moment that reminded me what humility looks like when no one's watching, or in this case, when everyone is." Marshall cleared his throat. He hadn't rehearsed this part. It wasn't in the PR packet, it wasn't in any approved talking points, but it needed to be said. "There's more," he continued, eyes locked on the rows of cameras. "After I boarded that flight, I sat beside Mr. Reeves. I didn't do it for optics. I did it because something changed. He treated economy class like it was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not beneath him, not beneath anyone." He looked down briefly, collecting his thoughts. "I sat next to him, and next to a young woman named Riley Ward, a passenger I hadn't noticed until then. She was nervous. She was quiet. But she had something in her hand, a folder. It said, "Audition Materials" on the front. She was flying east for something important, and in those next few hours I witnessed a kind of conversation I'll never forget. Not in words, not even in music, in presence. Marshall paused again, slower this time. June sang under her breath. He hummed in harmony. They never performed for anyone. It wasn't a show. It was something private. Healing, even. He hesitated, eyes blinking rapidly against the lights. I pretended to be asleep, but I wasn't. I was listening. In the park, Riley's eyes shimmered. She pressed her sleeve against her cheek, brushing away a single tear. Her phone shook slightly in her grip. Marshall looked back into the cameras. I sent a message to my daughter that night. We haven't spoken in almost a year. She dropped out of her music program after her final performance ended in silence. Not applause, not boos, just silence. She thought she didn't matter anymore. He swallowed hard. But watching Riley that night, watching Keanu show her that her voice had weight, something in me cracked open. I saw my daughter in that seat, and I realized I never asked her the right question. Marshall let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "Sue," I wrote her finally. Just one sentence. "I think I finally understand." The room stayed quiet. Not a single camera clicked. "I owe Mr. Reeves more than an apology," Marshall finished. "I owe him gratitude for reminding me what leadership looks like, what compassion looks like, not in headlines, not in business class perks, but in small, quiet decisions that ripple outward." He stepped back from the microphone, hands at his sides. "No more spin, no more pretending it was all a system glitch. I'm sorry, Mr. Reeves, and thank you." In the park, Riley whispered the words without thinking. "Me neither." She stood slowly, holding her phone to her chest. The audition was over, but something bigger had just begun. After the broadcast ended, Marshall stepped away from the podium, the applause hesitant at first, then rising slowly, not for theatrics, not for him, but for the rare feeling of a public truth told without polish. Reporters lowered their phones. The press coordinator looked stunned. Marshall simply nodded once and walked out the side door, ignoring the flurry of follow-up questions that followed him like rain. On a bench near the Boston Conservatory, Riley closed her eyes. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the phone. That apology hadn't been for her, not directly, but it felt like it was. It felt like it reached inside and acknowledged something she hadn't even known she needed. An affirmation that what happened on that flight was real, not a dream, not a fleeting coincidence, but a moment with weight. A couple strolled past her, laughing about something trivial. Across the street, traffic surged. Life moved on. But Riley sat still in the middle of it all, caught in the space between what had been and what could be. Her phone buzzed again. A message, unknown number. "I saw the press conference. I don't know what you did to my father, but thank you, Hannah Levin." Riley stared at the screen, heart thudding. She reread it twice, then 3 more times. Hannah. Marshall's daughter. The one who'd walked away from music. The one he couldn't reach. Until now. Riley felt a rush of emotion rising in her chest, too wide to name. She had no idea how Hannah got her number. Maybe Marshall had passed it on. Maybe it didn't matter. She typed a response, fingers unsure but heart steady. "I didn't do anything to him. He just sat beside someone who was scared to sing and reminded her she didn't have to be alone." No reply came immediately. Riley didn't expect one. She locked her screen and stood. Across the city, Keanu sat alone in a coffee shop tucked inside a quiet brick corner. No one had noticed him yet. He sipped black coffee, elbows resting on the scratched wooden table, a napkin folded into quarters beside his hand. He had watched Marshall's apology, too, from beginning to end. He didn't smile, he didn't react. But when it was over, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a pen, and scribbled something quietly on the napkin. Grace doesn't always come with stage lights. Sometimes it finds us in row 29. He set the pen down, folded the napkin again, and slid it into his jacket. Then he stood and walked out. On the bench where Riley had been, the sky above was streaked with light. A wind stirred, soft but sure. Somewhere in Boston, a girl had found her voice. A father had found a path back to his daughter. And a man who had every reason to expect the world to bend for him had once again reminded everyone what it meant to stand in the quiet and simply let others shine. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday. Plain, heavy, no markings except her name in small serifed letters and the Boston Conservatory logo stamped in blue in the corner. Riley stared at it for several minutes without opening it. Her hands, which had trembled so violently the night before her audition, were still now. The world outside her window hadn't changed. Same cracked sidewalk, same rust-red mailbox across the street, but everything inside her. She sat down on the floor, legs folded, envelope still sealed in her lap. 1,000 possibilities ran through her head. Maybe she'd made it. Maybe she hadn't. Maybe they liked her tone, but not her technique. Maybe they thought she was too raw, too fragile, too late. Or maybe they heard what she didn't know she was singing. That lullaby wasn't just a song, it was a history. She finally slid her finger under the flap and unfolded the pages inside. The first was official, thick paper, embossed crest, and words she had to read twice before they sank in. Congratulations. You have been accepted into the New England Conservatory's vocal performance program. Full scholarship awarded based on artistic merit and financial need. She pressed the paper to her chest and closed her eyes. Her breath left her in a single uneven gasp. She wasn't crying, not yet, but something in her, tight and guarded for so long, was beginning to soften. She set the acceptance letter aside and noticed a smaller note tucked behind the paperwork. It was handwritten, not printed. From the committee. Your audition was unforgettable. Thank you for your bravery. Please know that your voice will be protected and celebrated here. Welcome. There were no performance critiques, no rankings or technical assessments. Just that one word. Unforgettable. It was then she saw something else tucked into the bottom of the envelope. A simple, folded white card. Her name wasn't written on the front. Just a small smudge of charcoal at the bottom corner, as if someone had picked it up with stained fingers. Inside, only one sentence, written in steady, all-caps penmanship. Some of us spend a lifetime trying to believe we're allowed to sing. You reminded me we already are. She read it again, and again. No name, but she knew. Keanu. She didn't know how he got her address, or how he knew the timing, but somehow, he'd sent the words she needed most the exact moment she was ready to hear them. She held the card in her lap, hands shaking now, not from nerves, but something gentler. Gratitude. Wonder. A stillness she hadn't felt since she was a little girl, lying in the dark listening to her mother hum lullabies to keep the shadows away. That moment had returned, and this time, it was staying. The first person she called was no one. Riley didn't pick up her phone. She didn't rush to post the news. She didn't even shout. Instead, she walked quietly into the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and stood by the window with the folded card in her hand. It wasn't about telling the world, not yet. It was about holding this one moment close, before anything else could change it. The sun was filtering through the blinds, casting soft stripes across the wooden floor. She noticed things she hadn't really seen before. The chipped corner of the counter, the small humming sound of the refrigerator, the faded sticky note still stuck beside the stove that read, "You got this." Her roommate must have left it weeks ago, maybe longer. Riley read Keanu's words again, whispering them softly. "You reminded me we already are." A line like that could have sounded like poetry or pity coming from someone else, but from him, it felt like truth, carved gently into the skin of her story. She walked to the closet in her room, reached up to the highest shelf, and brought down a box she hadn't opened in years. Inside were things she'd kept buried. A photo of her mom holding a baby Riley, both of them wrapped in a blanket of mismatched colors. A cracked cassette tape with her mother's voice humming that lullaby, and a dried flower pressed in a book that once sat on her mother's bedside table. It still smelled faintly like lavender. For years, Riley had avoided these items. Too much pain, too many memories that carried sharp edges. But today, something had shifted. The sharpness was still there, but so was something new. A sense that maybe the pain hadn't been pointless. Maybe it had been preparation. She placed the letter and the card from Keanu inside the box, next to the flower and the tape. She wasn't hiding them. She was giving them a home, a place in the archive of her becoming. Then finally she sat down and opened her phone. No social media post, just one message. It was to Marshall Levin. She had remembered his story on the plane, about his daughter, about her fear. She didn't know what had happened after that night, but something in her wanted to reach across the unknown. Her message was short. "Thank you for sitting beside me. I hope your daughter sings again. If she ever needs someone to sit in the back of the room and listen, I'd be honored." She hit send before she could overthink it. Then she smiled. Not the nervous smile she wore before an audition, but the one that came when you know you've made peace with something, even if the world hasn't noticed yet. Outside, the sky was turning pink, and inside, Riley finally felt like she was allowed to begin. That evening, Riley walked to the local park with the acceptance letter tucked into her coat. The wind had picked up, the kind that rustled tree branches just enough to sound like whispers. She didn't mind. Each step felt lighter than the last. She sat on her favorite bench near the fountain, the one her mom used to bring her to when she was little. The water still bubbled the same way. Back then, she'd toss pennies into it and wish for silly things. Ice cream, a new backpack, a puppy. But tonight, she didn't throw a coin. She just watched. The letter sat open beside her. She traced the edge of Keanu's card again. The handwriting was unmistakably his, calm, confident, and a little slanted. She wondered how many people he had written to like this. Probably not many. But even if he had, it didn't matter, because this was hers. Not the attention, not the fame, just the reminder that someone who'd seen 1,000 stories still believed in hers. Behind her, a couple walked by and paused, noticing the paper in her lap. "Acceptance letter?" the woman asked kindly. Riley smiled. "Yeah, just got it today." "Congratulations," the man said, nodding. "What's it for?" Riley hesitated, then said it aloud for the first time. "The Boston Conservatory, vocal performance." The woman's eyes widened. "Wow, that's no joke. You must be incredible." Riley gave a soft laugh. "Not always, but I think I'm ready to try." They walked on, but the words lingered. That old voice in her head, the one that whispered doubt when she stood behind microphones or in front of mirrors, was quieter now. Not gone, but finally outnumbered. She pulled out a notebook she always kept in her bag. Flipping to a blank page, she began to write. Not lyrics, not a journal entry, just a letter. To herself. She started it simply. To the girl who thought she wasn't enough. She wrote about the late-night flight, the turbulence, the folder spilling open like a confession. She wrote about a stranger who didn't treat her like she was small, who sang harmony in the dark and reminded her that music didn't need applause to matter. She wrote about how kindness changes the air in a room, how a question like, did she stop singing? Or just stop singing in front of people, could echo louder than an ovation. And when she was done, she closed the notebook and held it to her chest. Not for anyone else to read, just to remember. She stood, folded Keanu's card gently, and tucked everything back into her coat. The world was the same, but she wasn't. She hadn't just received a letter, she'd answered one. The silent question her life had been asking for years. Do I matter? Yes. Yes, you do. And now it was time to sing like she believed it. The recital hall was nothing like Riley imagined. Smaller, quieter, more intimate. No grand chandeliers, no velvet seats. Just rows of wooden chairs and soft footlights spilling onto the polished stage. She peeked out from the side curtain, heart thudding beneath her borrowed black dress. The audience was already filling in, heads bowed over programs, murmuring in low tones. She didn't know he was there. Not yet. Keanu sat in the very back row, wearing a charcoal sweater and jeans, hands folded gently in his lap. He hadn't told her he was coming, didn't ask for a special seat, just blended in, a quiet shadow among strangers. No camera crews, no handlers, just him. Watching, waiting. The recital began with a cellist whose bow trembled slightly on the opening note, then a pianist, followed by a trio attempting a playful Debussy piece. The performances were good, technically clean. Polite applause followed each one, but the air in the room still felt restrained, like everyone was holding back just a little. Then Riley's name was announced. She stepped out slowly, eyes fixed forward, fingers brushing the side of her dress to keep from shaking. A faint murmur ran through the crowd. Nothing disruptive, just the sound of expectation. She moved to center stage, adjusted the microphone stand, then looked up. The lights made it hard to see faces, but just beyond the halo of glare she thought she saw him. A stillness in the back row. A presence. She closed her eyes and began. No piano, no accompaniment, just her voice. The song was held in silence. It had no sheet music. It never had. It was something her mother used to hum late at night, when sleep was hard to find and the apartment smelled like stale laundry and fear. A song without words. Notes bent around grief and memory. A lullaby that asked no forgiveness, only closeness. Riley didn't think about the judges or the teachers. She didn't think about the pitch or the breath support or what came next. She just sang. The room responded in stillness. No phones raised, no coughs, no rustling programs, only the sound of her voice pulling each person a little closer to the edge of their seat. Somewhere in the back row, Keanu lowered his gaze for a moment and took a deep breath. She held the final note longer than she ever had before, not because she was showing off, but because she could. Because this time, the silence that followed didn't scare her. It was welcome. It was deserved. It was hers. When it ended, there was a pause, a full 5 seconds before anyone clapped. And then they did. Not politely, not out of obligation, but fully. Someone even stood. Not many, but enough. Riley bowed once, then quickly left the stage. Backstage was chaos. Students laughing, hugging, rehearsing compliments. Some wanted to talk to her, but she politely slipped past them all, heading for the side exit that led into the hallway. She didn't expect him to still be there, but he was. Leaning against the brick wall just past the doors, hands in his coat pockets. No expression, no fanfare. Just him. "You stayed the whole time?" she asked, her voice hoarse from singing. "Of course," Keanu said. "It was the only ticket that mattered today." Riley looked down, smiling faintly. That song, it was different this time. He nodded once. It was alive. The hallway was quiet, the sound of muffled voices and applause fading behind them. Riley walked beside Keanu in the narrow corridor, each footstep echoing just slightly against the tile. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Outside, the winter night had settled in. The air was cold, crisp, but not biting. A soft mist clung to the edges of the campus lawn. Streetlights painted gentle pools of yellow on the walkway ahead. Keanu and Riley stepped through the front doors of the conservatory, the hush of the world wrapping around them. "Do you do this often?" she asked after a while. "Show up uninvited?" he replied, lips quirking. She smiled. "I meant attend recitals, quietly, In the last row. He considered it. Not often, but sometimes I think it's important to witness things, not control them, just witness. Riley tucked her hands into the sleeves of her coat. I thought I was going to fall apart tonight. You didn't. I almost did. That's part of it, he said. Art doesn't always come from feeling strong. Sometimes it comes from letting yourself feel weak. They walked past an old brick fountain. The water had been shut off for winter. She looked at it, then looked at him. Do you remember your first performance? She asked. He paused. Yeah. I was 17. Shakespeare, outdoors. The wind blew my cue line off the script and I froze. Whole crowd staring. I wanted to disappear. What happened? A guy in the front row coughed, loud, broke the silence, gave me a second to breathe. I picked it up and kept going. Did you thank him? He smiled. I never found out who it was, but I've tried to be that cough for other people ever since. Riley laughed. It wasn't the kind of laugh that tried to be loud or charming. It just slipped out naturally, like a sound she hadn't made in a long time. They reached the corner of the dormitory quad. A security light flickered softly above the door. She stopped and turned to face him. Thank you for being there. At the audition, at the recital. You didn't have to be. The employee who dared to ask. Most people say that, but they don't show up. Keanu looked at her, expression open, calm. Sometimes presence says more than applause. She nodded, absorbing the weight of that truth. He reached out his hand. She took it. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It wasn't a mentor-student moment soaked in sentiment or finality. Just a handshake, a connection. But something passed between them in that brief moment. Not a promise, not a goodbye, just an understanding. We'll meet again, Riley said softly. Keanu nodded. I believe that. She turned and walked to the dorm entrance. The door clicked shut behind her. He stood there for a few seconds longer, then walked back into the quiet street. The night held stillness again, but it wasn't empty. It felt full, like something had been sung into it, something real. The call came just after Riley's second voice lesson of the day. Her phone buzzed against the worn spiral notebook she always carried, its margins filled with half-written lyrics and personal reminders to breathe. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Normally, she wouldn't answer, but something in her gut told her this one mattered. Hello? A warm voice greeted her. Miss Ward? This is Patricia Lee. I'm calling from the office of the president of Blue North Airlines. Do you have a moment? Riley sat down on a bench in the corridor, gripping her phone tighter. Yes, I do. We're reaching out on behalf of Marshall Levine, Patricia continued, regarding a new initiative he's launching. It's called Skyline Voices, a national scholarship and mentorship program for young musicians and artists with limited access to training. And he'd like to invite you to serve as our inaugural ambassador and peer mentor. Riley didn't answer right away. The hallway around her blurred. I'm sorry. I think I misheard you. You didn't, Patricia said with a smile in her voice. He's spoken very highly of your courage, your story, and the message you carried with your music. We'd be honored if you'd help shape this program from the ground up. For a long moment, Riley just breathed. Then she laughed, quietly at first, then with a joy she couldn't suppress. Yes, I'd love to. Patricia gave her the basic details. There'd be travel, speaking events, even some small group mentorship responsibilities. Nothing overwhelming, but everything meaningful. Before they hung up, Patricia added, One more thing. Mr. Levin said to tell you, that song stayed with me. I hope it never leaves. Riley set her phone down gently after the call. Across from her, through a narrow practice room window, she could see another student struggling to stay on pitch. A week ago, that had been her. Today, she felt different. Not bigger, not better, just braver. At nearly the same moment, across the country, Keanu Reeves sat by a window in his small Los Angeles home, the light of late afternoon spilling across his desk. A letter lay open in front of him, printed on humble paper with a Portland return address. It was from the director of a local orphanage, a place Keanu had visited once, under a different name, no cameras, no entourage. The letter was simple. "Mr. Reeves, we just wanted to thank you. Because of your anonymous donation, we've hired 6 part-time music teachers for the next 3 years. We'll be able to offer guitar, piano, choir, and songwriting to the children in our care. One of our students, Jasmine, said this morning, 'It feels like my voice has a place to go now.'" Keanu smiled, not broadly but deeply. He folded the letter and placed it in a wooden box on the shelf behind him. A box filled with thank you notes, kids' drawings, and the rare letters that had nothing to do with movies or fame, just music, just memory. He looked out the window and whispered to himself, "It's not about the song being heard, it's about where it lands." That evening, Riley walked alone through the campus gardens, the air crisp with early spring. Every step felt surreal. A week ago, she had been another hopeful applicant. Now she had a scholarship, a recital behind her, and a phone call that could change lives beyond her own. The wind tugged at her coat as she reached a stone bench beneath a dogwood tree. She sat down, pulled out her folder of audition pieces, and placed it in her lap. But she didn't open it. Instead, she stared at the stars overhead, the ones barely visible between the lamplight and clouds. Her voice hadn't always felt like it belonged in this world. Growing up, it was too loud for her classmates, too quiet for judges, too shaky for church solos. Her mother had been the only one who never asked her to stop singing, until the silence of addiction had taken her away. Now, a door had opened, not just for her, but for others. Kids who, like her, had dreams that didn't come with instruction manuals or expensive tutors. She thought of Marshall Levin's daughter, of the way he'd looked on that plane when Keanu asked him the question that lingered like a suspended cord. Did she stop singing, or just stop singing in front of people? Riley pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app. No more hesitation. She started typing an idea for her first speech as Skyline Voices ambassador. The opening line was simple. "I used to think I had to earn the right to be heard. But now I know. If you have something inside you that wants to be sung, you already have the right." She saved the note and closed her eyes, letting the weight of the day settle. For the first time in a long while, the weight didn't feel heavy. It felt rooted, anchored. Back in Los Angeles, Keanu lit a single candle in his kitchen. He didn't need the light. It was habit, a ritual he had begun years ago after his sister's final cancer treatment. One candle, one quiet moment, no matter what the day had held. Tonight, though, he found himself humming softly. The melody wasn't famous. It wasn't even finished. Just a few notes, half remembered, from a time when he and a friend had sat in a cramped apartment, trading guitar chords and thoughts about whether art could change anything. Keanu had been 23. The friend had died the next year. He reached for a worn notebook in a drawer. The pages were uneven and smudged. In the corner of one, he scribbled the melody again. Beneath it, just one line. "Every voice leaves a fingerprint." He paused, then added, "Even the quiet ones." The candle flickered. Somewhere, a plane took off over the Hollywood Hills. Somewhere else, a young girl named Jasmine held a ukulele for the first time. And somewhere in between, a singer named Riley Ward prepared to speak, not just with her voice, but with her story. The boarding process at Gate 23 was quiet, almost meditative, as twilight filtered through the terminal's floor-to-ceiling windows. Keanu Reeves stepped forward with his ticket in hand, greeted by a flight attendant who clearly recognized him. She glanced at her tablet, then back at him with a mixture of awe and confusion. "Mr. Reeves, we've upgraded you to first for this leg," she said, managing a professional tone, though her voice had the warmth of someone honored to deliver good news. Keanu smiled, his tone soft. "Thanks, but would it be possible to switch to economy? Aisle seat if one's open." The attendant blinked. "Sir, you're sure?" He nodded gently. "I like aisle seats." After a short pause, she tapped on her screen, then handed back his boarding pass with a changed seat number. 29D, it's all yours." Keanu gave her a nod of thanks and stepped onto the jet bridge with nothing but a worn leather backpack slung over his shoulder. Inside the plane, economy class buzzed with the usual murmurs. People adjusting overhead bins, mothers calming toddlers, a few business travelers settling in early with their earbuds already in. Keanu quietly moved down the aisle, past curious eyes and surprised whispers. When he reached his seat, he tucked his bag under the seat in front of him, sat down, and folded his hands in his lap. He didn't pull out a book, he didn't check his phone, he just sat. 2 minutes later, a boy no older than 13 came cautiously down the aisle, his guitar case awkwardly bumping every seat corner it passed. His fingers clutched a guitar pick like it was a lucky charm, flipping it nervously between his thumb and forefinger. His seat, 29E, was right beside Keanu. The boy hesitated for a moment when he saw who was sitting next to him. His lips parted slightly, then closed again. He didn't say a word, just slid into the middle seat and sat rigidly upright. Keanu gave him a polite nod, not pushing conversation. The boy clutched the guitar pick tighter and finally blurted out, "First time flying alone?" Keanu turned slightly, his voice calm and easy. "That's brave." The boy shrugged, clearly nervous. His eyes kept drifting down to the guitar pick in his hand, turning it over again and again. Keanu gestured lightly. "First time playing a new song is scarier." The boy looked at him, startled. He didn't respond right away, but something shifted in his posture. His shoulders relaxed just enough to exhale the fear he hadn't realized he was holding. "You play?" the boy asked, almost whispering. Keanu smiled faintly. "Used to. Not very well, but I loved it." The boy looked at his pick again. "I write songs, not great ones, but I try." Keanu leaned back in his seat. "That's already more than most." There was no big conversation, no one filming, just two travelers in the back of a plane, speaking like equals, like strangers who understood something quiet in each other. The engines hummed louder, the runway neared, the flight was about to lift into the sky. But in row 29, something had already taken off. As the plane leveled out above the clouds, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft amber glow. Passengers settled into their routines, some scrolling through movie options, others pulling on eye masks or flipping open paperbacks. But in row 29, the boy still sat stiffly, his fingers working the edge of the guitar pick like a secret puzzle. Keanu turned his head slightly. "What's your name?" "Ezra," the boy replied, voice low. Keanu nodded. "Nice to meet you, Ezra." Silence again, but not awkward, more like a pause between verses. Ezra turned the pick over once more. "I'm going to see my dad. Haven't seen him since, 5? He doesn't know I play." Keanu didn't respond right away. He waited, giving the boy room to speak without pressure. "I wrote a song," Ezra added, "for him. Dumb idea, I know, but it's kind of all I've got." Keanu's gaze was steady. "It's not dumb." Ezra let out a shaky breath. "It's just, I'm scared you won't care, or laugh, or just not hear it." Keanu turned slightly in his seat, his voice softer now. "Sometimes people don't know how to listen until they've been silent a long time." Ezra looked at him, eyes wide. Keanu continued, "The right song can make them stop pretending they don't hear." Ezra didn't say anything, but the grip on his pick loosened. His hands fell to his lap. Slowly, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a wrinkled notebook. Inside were pages of chords, scribbled lyrics, half-finished rhymes crossed out and rewritten 3 times. He opened to one page in the middle. This is the one. Keanu glanced down. The top of the page read in uneven handwriting, "Tell me if you remember." The lyrics were raw. They didn't rhyme perfectly. The phrasing stumbled. But it had heart. A child's honest question buried in a teenager's voice. Ezra watched Keanu read. When he reached the bottom of the page, Keanu nodded once. "It's good. You're not just saying that. I don't say things I don't mean." Ezra blinked hard. The overhead fan dried his eyes too quickly. He turned his face toward the window. "Is it weird," he asked, "to hope someone who forgot you wants to remember?" Keanu didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached into the side pocket of his backpack and pulled out something small and folded, a piece of sheet music, crumpled but well-loved. He handed it to Ezra. Ezra opened it carefully. It was handwritten, notes flowing across the staff like a conversation frozen in time. At the top, a title, "Only the Quiet Remain." "Be yours?" Ezra asked. "A gift," Keanu said. "From someone who believed in me before I knew what that meant." Ezra traced the first bar with his finger. Keanu said quietly, "You don't need people to remember who you were. You just need one person to believe in who you are." Ezra stared at the music, then tucked it gently back into the sheet, folded it with care, and placed it into his notebook, like a sacred page. The plane hit a soft pocket of turbulence. Lights flickered. Ezra didn't flinch. He sat taller now, and when the captain came over the intercom announcing their descent, Ezra looked up with a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. The blog post went live at 6:47 a.m. Eastern Time. It was written by a flight attendant named Morgan Hale, a 10-year veteran of the airline who had quietly witnessed the entire episode on Flight 2674. Her title was simple: "What Kindness Sounds Like at 30,000 Feet." In it, she didn't mention Keanu Reeves's name in the headline, nor did she drop it until halfway through the article. But by then, the internet already knew. Her words were calm, almost clinical in tone. She recounted the last-minute downgrade, the refusal to make a fuss, the seat in row 29C, and the way Keanu had helped a young woman gather her scattered sheet music during turbulence. She described the moment a man in a suit arrived, apologized, and offered a quiet retreat to the front, and how that offer had been turned down. Not rudely, not dramatically, just turned down with a simple question: is someone else getting bumped to make room? Morgan added, "I've seen people yell over a meal choice. He sat 6 hours without reclining because he didn't want to inconvenience the man behind him." Then she wrote about the duet, how it was barely audible, how you had to be in row 28 or 30 to catch the soft harmony, rising and falling like waves. "I didn't film it," Morgan typed, "because it felt like church. Some things aren't meant for playback. They're meant to be lived once and remembered forever." She closed with this: "Keanu Reeves sat in economy and changed 3 lives without saying a word louder than necessary." By noon, her post had over 300,000 shares. By sunset, national outlets picked it up. Morning shows ran segments with animated reenactments. One network reached out for comment. Keanu's reps said he was unavailable and wouldn't be commenting. True to form, silence said enough. Marshall Levin read the blog from his office, his glasses slowly slipping down his nose. He didn't call PR. He didn't draft a response. Instead, he opened his calendar and cleared an entire week of meetings. Then he made a decision that surprised everyone, including the board. He issued a statement not through a press release, but through a live stream video, unpolished, unedited, from his office. He admitted to authorizing the seat downgrade. He explained the logic, how public moments could boost visibility in a struggling quarter, how they'd hoped a graceful reaction from a celebrity might go viral. But what he hadn't expected, he confessed, was to feel ashamed. Ashamed not because the plan failed, but because Keanu's decency had exposed the smallness of the strategy. Mr. Reeves didn't just forgive a mistake, Marshall said on camera. He led with quiet, with consistency, with grace. He reminded us that leadership doesn't always need a title. Sometimes it just needs row 29C. The clip traveled faster than the blog. Executives around the country forwarded it to their teams. Comment sections filled with gratitude, not for damage control, but for the truth. At the Boston Conservatory, Riley Ward sat on a bench in the practice hallway, watching the video of Marshall's apology for the third time. Her earbuds stayed in, even after the video ended. She didn't need more sound, just the silence that followed. She looked down at her calendar. 3 mentorship meetings this week, 2 planning calls for the first Skyline Voices workshop, and her first vocal masterclass as a guest speaker in a New York public school was a whirlwind. And yet, it felt natural. The program was taking off faster than anyone had predicted. What started as a single scholarship offer had grown into a national initiative backed by the Airline's Community Outreach Division. Riley had been chosen not just as a beneficiary, but as the face of it. The girl in row 29B had become a quiet symbol of perseverance, without changing a single thing about herself. And she hadn't done it alone. She still hadn't found the words to thank Keanu for staying that night after her recital, or for the handwritten card that came with her acceptance letter, or for choosing to sit beside her in the first place, even when comfort was offered elsewhere. A knock on the practice room door jolted her from her thoughts. One of the conservatory administrators stood holding a flyer. "You're being requested," she said with a warm smile. "Terminal B at Logan Airport, tomorrow. Community concert launch. You'll be opening with Held in Silence." Riley blinked. "At the airport?" "Yes, it's part of the new campaign. Every seat has a story. They're turning terminals into temporary stages, free concerts for travelers, pop-ups in waiting areas. They asked for you specifically." Riley smiled, a little overwhelmed but not afraid. Not anymore. The next day, she stood in front of Gate 42, a microphone clipped to her blouse, a keyboardist beside her, and travelers filtering in around her with carry-ons and coffee cups. Some paused, others kept walking, but a few stopped and stayed. She sang Held in Silence, not with trembling doubt, but with full voice. The lullaby once tied to sorrow now felt like a tribute, a reminder that music doesn't just remember pain, it redeems it. Halfway through the performance, a young boy holding a guitar case sat down cross-legged in front. His mother stood behind him, arms folded, protective and proud. A businessman in a wrinkled suit lowered his phone. A couple leaned into each other. Riley didn't see any of it directly, but she felt it. After the song, there was no applause, just stillness. And then, from somewhere behind the crowd, someone whispered, "She's the one from the plane." The words weren't shouted, but they rippled through the listeners. Travelers looked at her differently, not like a celebrity, but like a reminder of something human and fragile they'd almost forgotten. That night, the concert video was uploaded to the airline's official page. The final frame held one line in clean white text. Every seat has a story, some just begin at 29C. The stage was warm beneath her shoes, not from heat, but from memory. 4 years of steps, stumbles, and sudden courage had led her here. Riley stood center stage at the conservatory's grand recital hall, blinking under the soft amber lights. Her senior recital wasn't just an academic requirement, it was her reckoning. A full house waited in silence, and backstage, faculty whispered quietly into headset mics as the live stream flickered to life. The program simply read, "Riley Ward, voice, no flair, no frills. Just the name of a woman who had once trembled in row 29C on a red-eye flight, clutching audition papers like they were the last thing tethering her to hope. Now, those papers were long gone. The pianist gave a small nod. Riley took a breath. Then she began. She opened with a slow arrangement of Shenandoah, her voice tender and unforced. Not perfect, not trying to be. She sang it like someone remembering something precious, not performing for approval but offering a gift. The room swelled with the quiet hum of resonance. Her professors, many of whom had doubted she'd last past sophomore year, sat motionless, eyes glassy. By the second piece, a modern interpretation of Pai Jesu, she had settled fully into her body. No more fidgeting hands, no anxious glances toward the wings, just breath, sound, and belief. And somewhere, miles away in Arizona, a woman in a halfway house sat hunched over a cracked laptop, watching the live stream from the rec hall's website. Her fingers trembled against a chipped mug. She didn't know the login. A volunteer had helped her find the link. And now she stared at her screen as if watching a ghost come to life. "Riley," the woman whispered. She hadn't said her daughter's name aloud in years. She had missed the audition, missed the call, missed the letter. She'd missed nearly everything. But not this. Not tonight. When Riley reached her final piece, the room dimmed slightly, the lighting softened by design. The accompaniment faded to a quiet swell of strings. Her voice lifted into a lullaby. A song no one in the audience had ever heard before. Except one. And back in Arizona, the woman gasped, covered her mouth. Tears burst out of her with no warning. It was their song. A broken lullaby, barely remembered. Written not on paper, but in muscle memory, from a time before the fall. Before addiction, before CPS visits and broken promises and silence. She hadn't sung it in over a decade. She thought Riley would have forgotten it. She hadn't. As Riley sang, her voice raw and fearless, the woman scrambled for paper. Not to transcribe the lyrics, just to write something, anything. She didn't know what, but she needed to speak, now, to someone, even if she wasn't heard. The note she scrawled was messy, ink smudged by tears. It said very little. And yet, everything. "I heard you. I'm sorry I stopped singing. Maybe I'll try again." 2 days later, Riley sat cross-legged on her dorm room floor, surrounded by half-packed boxes. Graduation was only a week away, but the real weight pressing on her shoulders wasn't about moving. It was about what came next. The recital had gone better than she ever imagined, and her professors had praised her afterward with words she had once believed were reserved for other students. More polished, more connected, more stable. But she didn't feel like celebrating. She hadn't told anyone what the final song was. She hadn't even titled it in the program. She'd just called it Untitled. Her professors assumed it was something experimental or personal. A few asked if she planned to record it someday. One offered to help her submit it to a local composer's showcase. But Riley wasn't thinking about recordings or showcases. She was thinking about whether the song had reached its intended listener. There was a knock on her door. A small envelope had been slipped under it. Thick cream paper, no return address. Her name in uneven cursive on the front. Just Riley. She picked it up slowly, holding it like it might vanish if she moved too quickly. The handwriting stopped her cold. She knew it, or at least she remembered it from birthday cards when she was 5, or the notes left on the fridge when her mom worked late at the diner. It was the kind of handwriting that tried to be neat but always leaned too far left, like it was tired. Riley sat back down and opened the envelope. There was no letter inside, not in the traditional sense. Just a small, single sheet of lined notebook paper, torn at the edge. On it, 3 short lines, written with a blue pen that had started to run out of ink. "I heard you, and I'm sorry I stopped singing. Maybe I'll try again." Her breath caught. For a moment, she didn't know if she wanted to cry or run outside or scream. She stared at the note for so long that her roommate knocked gently to ask if everything was okay. Riley didn't answer. She couldn't yet. She placed the note on her desk, sat in front of it, and then reached for a small wooden frame from her shelf. It had been empty for months. She never knew what to put in it. A childhood photo felt too sad, a diploma too proud. But this was what it was made for. Riley slipped the note inside the frame. It didn't fix anything. It didn't answer every question. She still didn't know where her mother lived. Didn't know what "try again" really meant. But she knew one thing. Her voice had reached her. She had sung something into the world, not for fame, not for applause, but for memory, for healing, for hope. And it had gotten there. Later that night, as the lights dimmed across campus, Riley sat by the window of the nearly empty dormitory, her framed note in hand, and whispered a promise to herself. "I'm not done singing." Outside, the city buzzed like it always did, unaware that a quiet miracle had occurred in a room no one would ever tour. But sometimes the loudest changes begin in silence. Keanu Reeves let the phone rest in his hand long after the call ended. Marshall Levin's voice still echoed in his ear. Genuine, quiet, a bit nervous. "We're retiring the plane, Flight 714, the one from that night." Marshall had explained they were preserving part of it, turning the front section into a creative space at Logan Airport. A music corner, a place for travelers to pause, listen, maybe reflect. "We're calling it the Cabin of Silence. You inspired it." Keanu had thanked him, then politely declined the public ceremony. "Let it be about the idea," he'd said, "not about me." Marshall hadn't pushed. He understood by now that Keanu moved differently than most men with his level of fame. Fame was never the destination for Keanu. It was something he carried, like a bag, careful not to let it knock into others. A month passed. No press releases mentioned Keanu. The ribbon cutting came and went. A few music blogs picked it up. The airport released a quiet promotional video showing the interior. Reclaimed fuselage walls, vintage airline seats turned into listening pods, lyrics printed on plaques. One line stood out, carved into the rear wall in simple, flowing handwriting. "What we hold in silence still sings." Riley W. It was a lyric from the song Riley had performed at her recital. Held in silence. Keanu recognized it instantly, and that was enough to bring him there. He didn't tell anyone. Late on a Thursday evening, he took a quiet car from Cambridge to Logan. No fanfare, no entourage. Just a worn hoodie, an old canvas bag over his shoulder, and a man walking slowly through a terminal not meant for performance, but for passage. Security didn't recognize him. He liked it that way. Gate C-17 was dim, nearly empty. A janitor looked up from mopping. Keanu nodded once. The janitor stepped aside. Down a quiet corridor, past the old windows with runway views, was the new installation, the Cabin of Silence. He stepped inside. The lighting was warm, almost amber. Soundproofed walls gave it a strange peace, like time had taken its shoes off. There were no announcements, no boarding calls, no hum of engines, just space, stillness. Keanu stood for a moment near the entrance, letting it all settle. Then he walked the length of the small room. There were prints of handwritten music, instruments mounted to the wall, an old violin, a single brass trumpet, even a children's glockenspiel. In the center was a small stand with a guest book. He didn't sign it. At the back wall, under Riley's etched lyric, there was a shelf lined with empty music sheets and sharpened pencils. Beneath that, a simple drawer marked, "Leave something behind." He pulled it open. Inside, a few folded notes. A photo of a teenage girl in a marching band uniform, a guitar pick. Keanu reached into his bag and removed a single folded page. It was aged now, the corners slightly softened from time. On the page was the original composition of Held in Silence, handwritten in Riley's looping script, with small notes in the margins from her mentor at the conservatory. She had given it to him after her senior recital, told him to keep it until he met someone else who needed it more. But this space didn't need noise. It needed reminders, anchors. So he placed it gently in the drawer, on top of the others. At the bottom of the page, Keanu had added one simple line, for whoever needs to sing next. He closed the drawer without a sound. Keanu took a step back and looked at the wall once more. The lyric, "What we hold in silence still sings," seemed to shimmer under the soft overhead lighting. He didn't need applause. He didn't need to be seen, but standing there, in that quiet capsule of memory and meaning, he felt something rare. Peace. His thoughts drifted to Riley. He hadn't spoken to her in weeks, not since her last update about a mentoring workshop she was leading in New York. She was busy now, busier than ever. Her voice had begun echoing in places that once wouldn't have listened. She told him she sometimes still got nervous, still hesitated, but then she would remember that flight, that aisle seat, that impossible moment when silence became harmony. Keanu moved to one of the old airline seats along the side of the cabin. He sat down, feeling the slight give of the cushion beneath him, the same model as 29C. He smiled faintly. Somewhere down the hall, an airport announcement buzzed faintly through the glass. He couldn't make out the words. They didn't matter. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small black moleskin notebook. No logos, no branding, just a simple journal. He flipped it open to a page marked with a corner fold. There, in his own handwriting, was something he'd written the morning after Riley's audition. He had watched her walk out of that hall with a weight lifted. Not because the judges had praised her, but because she'd finally sung the truth. That had stayed with him. On the page, he'd scribbled a single line. Sometimes the most powerful sound in a room is the one that was almost never made. He tore the page out slowly, stood, and slipped it beneath the folded score in the drawer. Let it belong there now. As he moved toward the exit, he noticed a small boy standing just outside the glass, holding a violin case. His mom stood beside him, gently encouraging him forward. They looked hesitant, unsure if they could enter. Keanu stepped to the side, opened the door for them. The boy looked up at him. "Are you?" Keanu smiled. Just a simple nod, nothing more. "You play music too?" the boy asked. "Sometimes," Keanu replied. The boy looked past him into the room. "It's so quiet in there." "That's where music starts," Keanu said softly, before the first note. The mother mouthed thank you as they stepped inside. Keanu watched them for a beat, how the boy's eyes widened at the mounted instruments, how he instinctively walked toward the shelf of blank music sheets. Then Keanu turned and walked back down the hallway, his pace unhurried. The hum of the airport returned around him, along with the blinking signs and shuffling footsteps and rolling suitcases. But something in him felt different, like a page had turned, and he didn't need to write the next one himself. Not alone, anyway. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Back in the cabin of silence, the little boy picked up a pencil. He didn't write a note. He just drew a single staff of music lines, then placed the paper gently in the drawer. His mother looked on, tears forming. Next to the new paper, Riley's score rested, like a whisper waiting to be heard. The hum of the airport faded behind him. Keanu stood in front of the small glass-paneled room nestled beside Gate C-28, its metal frame shaped from the old fuselage of Flight 7114. A quiet plaque near the door simply read, "The Listening Cabin." There was no ribbon, no flashing camera, no red carpet, just the faint smell of polished wood and the sound of soft piano from inside. Keanu stepped in slowly. The cabin was smaller than he remembered, or maybe it just felt smaller because of what it had become. The seats had been replaced with smooth benches, each padded and facing inward, like a circle meant for conversation rather than travel. The back wall had a panel of handwritten lyrics, etched carefully into the surface with metal engraving. He moved closer. It was Riley's handwriting. The lyrics were from Held in Silence, the lullaby she had sung that night in Boston. The same one she'd performed at her senior recital. The same one that had stopped a room of judges cold and, somehow, kept singing even after the final note. There were lines carved into the metal that read, "I sang not because I was ready, but because the silence needed something true." Keanu blinked. His hand brushed the metal lightly. He took a folded sheet of music from his pocket. It was worn around the edges, a little torn. The handwritten score was faded in places, but it was still legible. He placed it gently on the small wooden table in the center of the room. It was the original copy Riley had sent him after her graduation. Held in Silence, written in full, in her hand. Beneath it, Keanu added a line on a small sticky note in black ink. "For whoever needs to sing next." He didn't linger. He stepped out as quietly as he came in. The next day, a quiet voiceover accompanied a montage of travelers moving through Logan Airport. A violin case rolled behind a teenage girl. A man in a wheelchair paused at the cabin's glass wall. A mother carrying a sleeping child glanced inside. Keanu's voice returned, soft and clear. "I took a seat no one wanted, but I sat beside someone whose voice the world needed. Sometimes the story isn't in the first-class cabin, it's in row 29C. The screen faded briefly to black. Then his voice came again, a little slower this time. "Have you ever been downgraded in life, only to find something more meaningful waiting for you?" There was no music, just stillness. A final image appeared. The lyric wall inside the listening cabin. On it, Riley's words shone in natural light. "I sang not because I was ready, but because the silence needed something true." Underneath the screen, 3 questions appeared. Tell us about a moment when the unexpected turned out to be a gift. What should Keanu discover or uncover next? Subscribe to hear the stories no one else is telling. But everyone needs to feel. No flash, no spectacle, just truth, gently placed, like a folded note left on a wooden bench, waiting for the next voice brave enough to speak.